Um, Guys, able to hear and see me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah. So basically, after like Vajpayee era, we still like saw BJP, Congress coming into power again, and that changed in the 2014 elections, where Modi came into power. This was the first time where they were coming into power again, and probably that's why they did not have a very strong mandate in terms of like passing policies. The second term of Modi and Amit Shah is probably seen as a lot more stronger in terms of their ideology, especially in terms of their uh, social policies. So when we see policies like the revocation of like the Jammu and Kashmir Act and all, we see that coming up in the second term itself, even though it might have been promised from like quite a long time. Even in the 90s, when the Rath Yatra was happening, this was something that was promised by the BJP because they saw it as antithetical to democracy, where some states have special statuses. But they were only able to implement such policies when they had the large mandate of the people, and that's what we saw. I won't spend much time in this because I think like most people know about Modi and Amit Shah to a fair extent. I'll spend like just a very short time. Basically, in terms of how Modi is able to portray himself. Modi, even though we might see instances where BJP leaders necessarily celebrate Hindu violence itself or call for Hindu violence, we see that Modi often wants to like stand against it, or the larger idea of saffron terrorism which exists in India, right? Of mob lynchings that exist. Like you never see Modi ever coming out and largely supporting that. That's majorly a strategic thing to do because at any point of time, terrorism or like an act of violence is not seen as something that's quite good in the Indian economy. And that's why the large, like to appease the larger masses, Modi needs to have a much more neutral or a much more moderate standpoint to Hindutva policies itself. But at the same time, you're able to see a lot of BJP leaders who are able to celebrate like Hindu vigilantism, mob lynchings, and all, are able to bring the leaders or people who have conducted these sort of things in the forefront or like celebrate them or hold them victorious. But that's not something that Modi particularly does. The second thing to note is probably how Modi also uh, like shows himself as the poster boy of the modern day BJP, right? It's a quite reformed BJP. It's a BJP that they want to show as a pro business to get the youth votes. And this is something that happens in 2014 also. So two reasons as to why BJP comes into power in 2014. A, because of like the anti-corruption like mandate of like Anna Hazare and of what do you say, Aam Aadmi Party and Arvind Kejriwal at point in time holding the Congress accountable. So it was definite that the incumbent Congress would be losing out, right? But there was a power vacuum which was at that point created in 2014, something that the BJP has been waiting on decades to necessarily like create have this opportunity where they can come into power when they come into national interest. BJP for a long time has also been a party which has majorly been in the northern states. There could be multiple reasons of this, just because maybe strong regional parties exist in the southern states, or also because like the whole idea of like Hindu majority is a lot more appeasing to like North Indian individuals. It could also be like the Hindi language, which is in which like you often see Modi and Amit Shah and often BJP leaders making their speeches being a lot more appeasing to North Indian states, or a majority of like North Indian states speaking the language of Hindi. So there could be multiple instances as to why they were more popular in North India, but to a certain extent, they weren't a regional party, right? They were still a national party, and they still had some control in South India before 2014. We obviously saw that increase quite a bit in states like Karnataka, where BJP came into power. Even in states like Kerala, which is still quite dominated by Congress and CPI, we still saw BJP and the rise of BJP in those states itself. In states like Maharashtra, it was bound to happen because the regional party Shiv Sena existed, which has a similar ideology itself, right? So the rise of BJP happened from the North Indian states, from this like the Hindu majority, and it was largely the narrative of like the Hindu being having a minority complex within a majority and creating a sort of uh, vulnerability within the Hindu majority, which they were able to then politicize itself, right? Uh, that's pretty much it. And probably also the last point is Modi portraying himself as someone who's very poor, as someone who did not have a lot of opportunities, but worked hard to like worked hard within the RSS to rise up the ranks and become now the like prime minister of a country, right? This is also important to note in terms of how the BJP is perceived as a party which is also more open to change than what the Congress is. So because of this narrative, BJP is also seen as a party which in which individuals can rise through the ranks, that you can support the BJP as a lower party leader or the RSS at some point in time, and then grow within the system of the BJP, right? And that growth is at least seen, even if it's not true, it's seen as something that's probably quite accessible, or like you can grow within the BJP rather than growing within the Congress itself, right? A last point to note in the rise of the BJP is the RSS and like their uh, like bodies. So there's also another reason as to why the BJP has come majoritarily into power is because of the large scale mobilization that it's able to do. I'm not going to say it's a grassroots level campaign that the BJP run, but I think they're able to reach the grassroots, is what I mean. That parties or like the youth parties of the BJP or the like wings of the like student wings of the BJP are able to mass mobilize the Indian majority, right? And at that point in time, we see that's why they've come into power. The RSS ban happened three times in history. One in 1948, when basically Nathuram Godse killed Mahatma Gandhi, and that's where we saw the RSS being banned as a political organization first. We saw it in 1975 again during the emergency, where again BJP leaders actually were at the forefront of things like freedom and liberty of the press. Uh, it's quite like ironical when you look at it like right now, but it's also something that's true. And like the BJP, sorry, the RSS was again banned at that point in time in 1975 as being a political organization which was like antithetical to the state and anti-national to the state. In 92 also the BJP, sorry, the RSS was banned again, where basically you had where basically it was the reason of the Babri Masjid, which was like demolished under like after like post the Yatra, and that's why a large scale amount of Hindu terror registered riots that happened, obviously in Gujarat in 2002, but even before that, after the destruction of the Babri Masjid, the riots that happened in North Indian states itself are enough testament to be banning the RSS itself, and it became a quite violent body. Even today and for a long period of time, the RSS and other VHP, like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and other like some of the bodies have been banned by the United States or have been termed by the CIA as like violent terrorist organizations. There's obviously like open like room to interpretation as to whether like the US should be intervening in our like spaces of sovereignty, but that's something to note as to where the RSS stands. And the RSS obviously has been the backbone at that point in time of the BJP, but then been able to mass mobilize individuals on ground. Uh, is there any doubt before I move to the last section of this workshop? Okay, so I'm just gonna move on. Regional parties, right? Something to note before I go into specifically into regional parties is that how like coalition as a point, and this often comes up in debates because you often see coalitions existing in terms of like the government efficiency when a coalition is there, or you look at it in status quo in terms of the opposition to the BJP, because the BJP does hold a large mandate. Uh, Realistically, you can only form a coalition in status quo against the BJP, although like surely regional oppositions could also come up. Something that's important to note probably is that it's always beneficial when standing up to a national party, there's another national party. And the true fact or the like sad fact is that the Congress is the only alternative in terms of the national party which we have against the BJP. even if you can have a coalition of regional parties itself, the mandate will be quite sketchy because most regional parties only have policies which cater to their own states. So, like the TNC in Bengal has more leftist policies which cater towards their own state itself. The Aam Aadmi Party has policies which caters only towards the center, like Delhi. Even though we see like Aam Aadmi Party increasing a little bit, I'll get into that in terms of like Punjab states and all. But we still see mostly the regional parties only catering towards regional issues and having policies or having a mandate towards those regional issues, having a stance on those regional issues. And that's why probably a national party is important. The other thing is national parties give large resources, right? They have a lot of resources that exist within their political machinery because they've been national party for decades now, and that's why it's probably beneficial to always form coalitions, right? Something that's important to note is that it's not just that the mandate of, you often argue that when regional parties come into coalitions with larger national governments, they often dilute this thing. Sure, that's true, but it's also true that the national parties made to dilute a lot of their policies. It's particularly important to note because understand a coalition is a contract between parties in which they are which they are basically coming together and forming an either an opposition or a government against a larger another majority, right? In this case, that's the BJP which exists, right, in status quo, and that's the reason as to why a lot of parties, even national parties, have to give up their more controversial policies at that point of time. So what we call a common minimum, which I've noted down, is important to note that often the more controversial policies of parties is compromised upon to reach, surely you could say, a watered down approach, but a common minimum ground which all these stakeholders within that coalition could agree to. In the NDA, and when the NDA came up first during like Vajpayee's era, sorry, you had like the policy which they had in terms of Ram Mandir, in terms of JNK, in terms of uniform civil code. All of those had to be compromised when the NDA had to form coalitions with regional parties, with let's say the Shiv Sena, which still it was quite easy because it was quite ideologically similar to Shiv Sena. But when you look at NDA and like the BJP forming coalition with the TNC, that could only happen when TNC is able to, or Mamta is able to tell in West Bengal that hey, sure, this party might have conducted some bad things, but it's a secular party. At the point of it, it's giving away its like largely controversial, quote unquote, controversial issues, right? And that's why we see that largely the BJP, for them to also come into power, them also come into the national spotlight, they had to form coalitions with the TNC, and they had to give up a lot of their controversial policies initially. Another instance is probably the UPA too. This was quite important to note. Another time where TNC held them because understand West Bengal still was quite an important state in terms of the swing voters that happened in terms of national elections, and that's why most of the UPA too and the policy paralysis which happened UPA too, where they were trying for a more free market like policies or more FDI pumping into our economy, all of this was restricted because TNC was still a coalition within UPA2 along with the Congress, right? And TNC is a party which represents the leftist ideology. In that point of time, their economic policies were quite different, and that's why they had to compromise. Like the UPA2 had to compromise, even if Congress had a larger number of people, they needed the TNC votes to form the government and to have large majority itself. Uh, but note that only happens in coalitions when like the BJP has a larger mandate. Like we saw in 2019, we saw that like they had the more extreme or the more quote unquote controversial policies that they were able to implement, and they were able to successfully keep up their mandate without diluting it down, right? Uh, Okay, coming to regional parties then, and firstly in terms of the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, there are often debates about the Aam Aadmi Party coming up and being so the debate is about should you regret the Aam Aadmi Party ever coming up? That is like if the Aam Aadmi Party is just better off as a social movement under like Anna Hazare or Arvind Kejriwal, or should it have formed like political like alliances? That's one probably debate which you could have in terms of you having to compromise on some of your quote unquote principles at the point of time you have to form like a political party and you have to make certain compromises, but it's also like practically quite beneficial. There's also another way where you could argue that social movements should like or leaders of these social movements should stay leaders because they can be the individuals of or the strong individuals within civil society that exist, that can hold or criticize the government in power. This is also quite important to understand as to how like criticizing and how mass mobilization can happen within a state when these like strong like leaders of social movements exist, right? The other thing to note in terms of the national party of Aam Aadmi Party is that sure right now it's a very like nascent party. We see and we know that for parties to grow they need probably decades, so it's quite like we can only presume as to what their larger agenda could be, although it's important to note that anti-corruption is a good like agenda which most of the Indians or most of the masses would end up supporting, right? They were able to gain the mobilization within Delhi because like they had their like grassroots level campaign running in Delhi. They did not have that sort of resources in all around India, but in the case that they do, it's probably something that would be successful in the future. Something probably more recent in Aam Aadmi Party is to note the pro-Hindu sentiment. And this has come up right after like the CA protests where like Arvind Kejriwal went to pray in a temple when the violence against Muslims happened. People on both sides were killed, but sure, individuals of the Muslim community were hurt a lot more in these sort of protests, or even in terms of being targeted by the violence of the Hindu majority or the Hindu mosques, right? It's important to note that Aam Aadmi Party can't take up a stance which is quite which is like quite anti-Hindu, or which will support CA protests probably strategically, is probably a strategic stance which they take up where they know that they are also catering to a large amount of Hindu voters. And at that point of time, the frame in which the BJP frames its policies is that either you're with us or you're against us. And that to a lot of people necessarily creates it in such a way where if you're not supporting like the BJP, you're not supporting the Hindus, you're being anti-national, anti-Hindu itself, which is also something that the Aam Aadmi Party can't sacrifice upon because it's strategically bad for them. And that's why you see the Aam Aadmi Party being quite strategic in the way they campaign. And the way they campaign is probably also then about on the lines or on the frame of development, that they actively denounce any politicization on the basis of religious line, but at the same time they argue for development and pro-welfare policies of the center itself, right? And that's why it's important to note that they have been strategically been able to frame the religion aspect out of the debate for a long time, although that's certainly decreasing where you see Aam Aadmi Party losing some of its votes, but we've been successfully seeing that Aam Aadmi Party has been representing Delhi and has been getting the votes or has been able to convince the voters of Delhi with its pro-development policies itself. The other important party is probably the TNC and CPI, and CPI also has a lot of different like parties within it. It could be CPIM, could be CPIML, which is Marxist or Leninist, basically. Uh, these are the two like left-leaning parties, and probably like very staunchly left-leaning parties in terms of both their social and welfare policies. The important note about the TNC is probably that it's a party which is, even though it's been in West Bengal and only been a regional party in West Bengal, it still has claims as to what what they will have uh, if they ever come into power or when they're in the opposition, what is their economic policy or what is their economic mandate, right? For not just Bengal but for the larger India. This is not to say that other regional parties don't. We just think that like TNC has been able to portray that as such. But TNC, in terms of their support and their control, has been limited to West Bengal. In the recent elections, also they lost a large chunk of their votes to the BJP. This would come out of like the sort of religious lines on which BJP has been able to frame their election again in West Bengal. where the TNC, where they're able to frame two things that A, the TNC has been rigging a lot of elections, doing booth capturing, which is somewhat also true, which is not untrue, but the obviously the exaggeration of this has led to the like loss of the TNC itself. Second thing is probably the way the TNC appeases what do you say Bangladeshi immigrants inside West Bengal, and how the BJP is able to capture that in terms of again the pro-Hindu and the anti-Muslim rhetoric of mostly Muslim Bangladeshi immigrants coming into West Bengal, and the TNC giving out citizenship towards these individuals in very like unregulated manner, which something the BJP has been able to control. Also, we've seen recently that the like TNC's policies, the left-leaning policies have been quite like A have been quite limiting the growth of West Bengal as a state itself. Uh, During the time of independence, West Bengal was probably the state which was the highest in terms of its GDP growth, and it was quite high towards their contribution towards like the national GDP. It's I think currently it's somewhere in the third or fourth position in terms of contribution to GDP because of the like the large scale industrialization which happened during the colonial era itself in West Bengal, but we see that being very stifled and being saturated at that point of time because of lack of growth and lack of like the TNC ever implementing pro market policies within their own state, right? Similar to that, CPI has probably been more open to change. That's also because they know that they need to change according to the masses, but TNC has been more reluctant to change, and that's why has been losing a large chunk of their votes in West Bengal itself. Another point to note is the Telugu Desam Party, the TDM. Uh, this is a party majorly in Andhra Pradesh and in Telangana. This was also the party which was like largely responsible for like like the mass mobilization of Telangana farmers, which led to Telangana being separate, having a separate state itself apart from Andhra Pradesh. This issue has existed honestly or even before the independence of India, and this issue was but was only be able to like what do you say mobilized by the TDP, and they have a lot of support itself within Andhra Pradesh and Telangana itself. The DMK and the AIDMK and all the other parties which exist in Tamil Nadu then are parties center to the anti-center rhetoric. They they still portray in terms of their rhetoric or the narratives or the propaganda that they necessarily hinge their bets on is the anti-center, the anti what do you say Hindi rhetoric itself. So that's why we've seen Tamil Nadu isolatory in its isolation growing a lot as a state, but it's also a state which has large amount of welfare policies towards the poor. It's good to have welfare policies towards the poor, but this has also been disenfranchising the general individuals or the individuals of general quota to stay in Tamil Nadu itself. And that's why we see a large amount of brain drain within Tamil Nadu itself because of the policies of the AIDMK in terms of the pro-welfare policies that they have. But it's also important to note that even if there's large amount of upliftment of the lower caste within Tamil Nadu, it's also the state probably with the largest amount of caste violence, along with like UP and other states where caste violence is quite large. Tamil Nadu is another state where caste violence itself is quite a like major issue which they haven't been able to solve at that point in time. The next is probably Shiv Sena, which ideologically aligns with the BJP. It's quite similar in the BJP in terms of its pro-Hindu like propaganda, but the difference probably is to note that they had political differences because of which the Shiv Sena and BJP weren't like coming into a coalition. Before in the NDA, the Shiv Sena and the BJP were together. Now they aren't particularly together. This could also be another reason as to how like Shiv Sena has probably been a very failed party where it hasn't been able to largely represent the Maharashtrian or the Marathi voters itself. Uh, even though during the times of Bal Thackeray, who's the founder of Shiv Sena, also Shiv Sena comes from the like name of Shivaji, who was a ruler in Maharashtra of the Marathi regiment, right? So understand that even though like they were able to gain the larger support or the larger mandate of the people in Maharashtra during Bal Thackeray's era, we see that being quite diminished under Uddhav Thackeray, and like the split within the Shiv Sena also might have been contributed to that. Another party important is JDS, or Janata Dal Secular. It's a party which is in a lot of southern states. Majoritarily, I think the important role that they play is in the state of Karnataka. In the recent elections which happened, and this is like you might have also seen the news around like people shifting parties stances and all, like people moving away from the Congress and to the BJP. Before that ever happened, the Janata Dal, even though it's quite small in terms of how they're able to gain the majority in what do you say, gain the votes in uh, Karnataka, it's able to be the party which is able to get the majority within equal sides. But what I mean by that, it's basically where in a state like Karnataka, which is quite closely contested between the Congress and the BJP, it's always been closely contested between these two parties. JDS basically is a party which is uh, which will which will be the deciding factor. Basically, like JDS is the party with which either the Congress or the BJP aligns to form the majority within the state and to take control of the legislative assembly within that state, right? So that's why it becomes particularly important. That's why we see the JDS leader being like this chief minister itself. Although obviously this is not something that the BJP is quite interested in, and that's why they have been poaching a lot of Congress leaders uh, and gain the majority without JDS being there. It's because JDS correlating with the BJP also leads to some diminishing what do you say, diminishing power of the BJP in terms of its state policy that's able to implement itself. Uh, Another party then to note is the Bahujan Samaj party. This is also something that comes from other like Samajwadi party and all itself, but basically hinges its bets on the Muslim Yadav votes or the lower caste OBC votes in Uttar Pradesh and neighboring states. Uh, this the current leader is Mayawati and has been for a very long time. There are other like parties also which have been split away from the like initial Janta Party, which also like compete for the largely Muslim and Yadav votes or the OBC votes itself within these northern states. I won't go too much into it because they have also been diminishing the power because caste-based politics has surely been successful for decades now, but has been diminishing in terms of how we see the BJP being able to garner the larger masses, not just the Hindu majority, but also being able to portray itself as a party for caste-based politics. So how they're able to basically include the lower caste within their sort of governance system or within their politics is important to understand. One thing to note probably is that it's probably because of the like perception of the BJP itself, contrary to the perception of the Congress, which is still quite exclusive and still quite hard to improve or have a growth in as a political leader. BJP is seen as a party at least where this thing happens more. Uh, this has also led to something that's probably demanded in status quo is the democratization of Congress, right? That we need the Congress to democratize, where it's a national party which says it represents the larger majority of India, but we also see like the Congress failing to democratize when they fail to ensure that like in Karnataka when they fail to tell that like the JDS leader will get the chief minister role or the important positions within the government will be given to the coalited what do you say party at that point in time or a regional party itself. So at that point in time, Congress has been quite failing under Rahul Gandhi's era or even Sonia Gandhi's era actually to democratize itself. At least it's a perception. There have been surely attempts to this democratization. It's not to say there haven't been, but it's been quite in a way where like the Congress hasn't really democratized or is in the perception of the larger masses. The Congress is still a party which is quite corrupt, which is quite exclusionary, which is quite Luton, which is or Luton elitist policy making, in terms of their ideology. Uh, so yeah, in terms of that, the perception of the Congress is surely bad. Now, future can only say what the Congress is likely to do or not. There have been instances where you said like Shashi Tharoor should start heading the Congress, or there are other individuals within the Congress, the old guard of the Congress, which never really represents, and it's still been quite nepotistic as a party, and only been like a power hold of the Gandhi family itself, right? So all of those claims are fair to make, and it's like future will only tell as to what the Congress will do in terms of will it democratize or not. But what's important to understand is that this democratization of the Congress is probably essential for the survival of the Congress in the modern day, like Indian politics. We can only see, and we also see that regional parties, even though they're able to hold a stronghold against the BJP, they can never have a legitimate chance against the BJP if they don't have national presence. And when we see that most of these regional parties that exist only have the presence within their own states, or only have policies catering or governance catering towards their own states, we see that these parties won't be able to have a large national mandate. And that's why they do need the Congress at that point of time. But it's also true that the Congress needs them to survive as a party, because it's quite failing, and in exponentially failing, I would say, after 2014, uh, after the like whole anti-incumbency era of the Congress existing itself. With that, I'd like to end with a few references that you can probably read up on, which I also get my information on. I've tried to give like this workshop has tried to be a more guidelines approach to where you can study more into Indian politics. Uh, and necessarily you need to still read up a lot more and read this in a lot more depth and nuance, all of these issues, because there's like a limited like 1 hour time or something that I have to give this workshop itself. Try to limit it to that. That's why I give these references itself. So for readings, you could read like India After Gandhi by Ramchandra Guha, or India After Independence by Bipin Chandra. Both of these books are really good uh, when you want to read up of the historical policies of, like, if you want to read about Nehruvian socialism, or you want to read about like the liberalization of the economy or the rise of the BJP itself. So historical policy, or even the emergency, in fact, it's quite nuanced within that book. So you can give it a read if you want a more nuanced understanding of the history of Indian politics, which is often quite important to understand the current status quo of where we are, really, because where we are isn't a result just of a random occurrence of, like, what do you say, the BJP coming into power. This has been a like a decades long, and they've been doing the Rath Yatra even before that. Since the 70s they've been fighting for these things, right? uh, so we see that change is often quite long term when we see Indian politics as a multi-party system itself. But it's also important to note how these, like, it's important to understand this history in a more nuanced way at that point in time. The other, what do you say, reference that I have is the debate kits of EPW. So if you just Google, or if you follow this link, if you just Google, what do you say, EPW debate kits, or if you just follow this link, basically you'll get a bunch of academic journals or like studies which tell you exactly where things like the social movement happened. So like a more nuanced understanding of the Mandal Commission itself, of probably individuals like Periyar itself, a lot more. So social movements quite well, uh, like like I would say the resources for that are quite uh, together and like well documented in this debate kit. You could also read up on Indian feminism within this debate kit. Another thing that has quite a lot of academic journals to support it. Other aspects which are probably a lot more general are things like democracy and stuff, which I think you might even know, even if you don't like read these journals. Apart from that, if you have like daily, if you want to keep up with the current affairs of Indian politics, I would recommend reading like the Economic Times, the Hindu, and the Caravan. These are not an exhaustive list. These are something that I particularly follow, and you often have to limit yourself in terms of how much you read. I'm not saying that you should limit to certain sources, but there's only like a finite amount of time that you have to read up. So if you have a particular preference to, let's say, Live Mint or The Wire, these are definitely decently well, like good documented resources. It's just important to note is that whatever source you read up Indian Ball on, there is going to be some amount of biases and some extent of bias that exists within that reporting itself. So it's often good to read up on Indian politics from different sources, and also get a quite diverse point of view than just like a single source where you read Indian Pol on. Apart from that, if you really want like a really good understanding itself, like I highly recommend watching the Rajya Sabha TV debates. I know this is somewhat like slow and somewhere boring itself, but like this is probably the pinnacle of your like reading up on Indian politics, because the most nuanced discussion happen within like those Rajya Sabha TV discussion or TV debates itself. So I would recommend like watching that. This is also available online. It's not just on TV. You can also watch it on like online itself. I think they have archived most of these, so you can still watch like the previous or the past debates itself. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, I'll just check the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions there. So I'm going to assume that everyone understood whatever I said. Thanks a lot, guys, and I hope you guys have a much more like nuanced understanding now of Indian politics and are able to debate the topic a lot better itself. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thanks.